Hello, everyone. Well, after my first proper episode, I thought, well, I've got really, really big boots to fill with someone following up after Mr. Trevor Colt. So I thought, who could it be? Who could it be? And what can the subject be? So I thought, how about my friend who I call affectionately Sir Jack Sacco? Jack is a Pulitzer-nominated author. If you look in the background there of his picture, there's an amazing shot of his father, who was one of the first men to liberate Dachau. That will be a conversation for another time, but he's an accomplished man. He's an accomplished composer. But what we're going to talk about today is something very close to my heart. We're going to dispel a lot of, how can we put it, falsehoods, Jack, that people say, because Jack is actually an expert on the Shroud of Turin. So, Jack, thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you, man. How you doing?
Yeah, you
How have you been?
I've been really good. You know, it's crazy,
Good.
and I'm doing this, which is kind of weird. You know.
No, it's good. You're made for this.
So I want to just jump straight into it, because I know
Yeah.
I've got you for a short amount of time. You're a very busy man. But can you tell people a little bit about your upbringing and where you went to school and how you got involved in the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah, I attended the University of Notre Dame, where I studied mechanical aerospace engineering. And so I was an engineer for several years. And at one point, and also did a lot of work in media and television production, and sort of made a transition into that at one point. And I was approached by, of all people, my mother, who said, "Hey, why don't you do some research about the Shroud of Turin?" And I said to her, in my wisdom, I said, "Well, no, thanks." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I read in the newspaper or saw on TV, whatever, years ago, that it was a fake. And that's, I don't need to go beyond that." She said, "Well, you saw that in the newspaper?" I said, "Yeah." She said, Do you consider that actual credible research to read something in the newspaper?" I said,
Fake
"No."
news, Jack. Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake
So
news.
fake. Exactly.
Fake news.
So I
Fake
thought,
news.
well, she said, "Well, why don't you just do some research and find out on your own? Because you have she was telling me that I have the technical capability to discern and to understand the actual raw data." So I went and made contact with a few of the scientists who had studied the Shroud back in the 1970s. And they were gracious enough to allow me not only to speak with them, but to look at their data, their raw data. And these were guys, men and women around the world, really. And there were about 40 of them. And they, interestingly, Matthew, they told me, they said, nobody's ever really asked me anything. They said and they also said, if they did ask, when I would tell them, they would mix it up. They would come out with a different story than what I said. They wouldn't tell, the whole truth. And the fact was that, just a short version was that they said that a lot of these guys went into it skeptically, thinking, I can prove that it's a fake. It must be a fake. They went into it with the same attitude as I did. And they said, well, every one of them said to me, we never found any evidence to indicate that it's fake. And we'll show you the evidence that we had. And I'm talking about, engineers. I'm talking about physicists. I'm talking about textile experts. I'm talking about medical doctors, and on and on and on. So it was 40 different people from all different disciplines. And so at that point, I said, well, there's more here than meets the eye. And I realized that there are a lot of myths about the Shroud. And a lot of people have these really strong opinions, but their opinion, and I realized that the opinion was based on no facts. It was just an opinion, and there were no actual data to back that up.
Well, it ends up that the funny thing is about the Shroud of Turin, it's kind of like tossed in with all these other kind of fantastical things, Atlantis, and which by the way, now, I mean, thanks to Joe Rogan, people are looking at that a little bit closer. But there's a lot of, it's kind of like, oh, the Shroud, it's on the National Enquirer, along with like space aliens and Atlantis and all these other things. And I know for me, I bought into that as well. I was like the Shroud
Yeah,
of Turin, like, but yeah, that's been debunked, right? Like they debunked that in,
right.
when was it? Like the late 70s, was it?
Yeah, early 80s, whatever. They
Early
came out with a
80s, yeah.
carbon dating in the 80s, and they said, oh, it must be fake. Uh, but
But
I
you can
explored
discuss
that.
that, right? Yeah, you can discuss. So sorry, I apologize for interrupting you. Carry on, please.
No, 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 not at all. Not at all. You ask the questions, I'll answer. Let's do it that way.
Let's do it that way. So you started looking into this, right? You went around and met a bunch of people, and there was someone else that was involved with that, right? That you met in Hollywood, of all places.
Yeah, yeah. You're talking about a young lady named Loretta.
Loretta Young, a little
Loretta.
not very well known actress that didn't win an Oscar, and yeah,
Yeah,
she was amazing.
she was actually the first person to ever win an Academy Award and an Emmy. Um, and she, I befriended her. She actually called me up because she heard of some of the things that I was doing. And she actually, interestingly enough, you mentioned music composition in the intro. She heard some music, some orchestral music that I composed, and she called me up and asked me if I was the composer. And I said yes. She said, can you send me some recordings of this music? Because I heard some of it, and I want to give some recordings to some of my friends. And it turned out that the friends that she gave it to were Nancy Reagan and Betsy Bloomingdale and Marie Gallo
Yeah.
and the group that crowd, Rosie, not Rosie, but anyway, John Wayne's wife, Josie. It was a group of Loretta's friends. So we became good friends after that. And then I was telling her about the stuff that I'd learned about the Shroud because it was around that time and that I was just discovering all these things. And she said, you know what? This is very important that you are able to go unrestricted and go wherever you need to go in the world and do this research because this could be very important for people. And I said, well, I'll do what I can. She said, no, you'll do whatever you need to do because I'm funding this. And she put
That's
up
amazing.
the financing for me to go around and interview people. And I went all over this country. I went all over Europe and, just interviewed some amazing people.
So let's get into the Shroud of Turin
Right.
because you have an amazing presentation. This is actually the first time I ever met you. You were doing a presentation just off Sunset Boulevard, right? I think it was Sunset Boulevard, and
That's right. Sunset.
yeah, in the center of Hollywood. And I sat there and I was like, okay, I'm going to go to this thing. It's about the Shroud, and I'm kind of like curious about these things.
Yeah.
And I sat there, and at the end of it, like it was like a pin drop in that place. It was unbelievable because you went through systematically and debunked all the conspiracy theories, by the way. That was the first thing, with data, with scientific data.
Right.
And then you came to a conclusion after that. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to hand over the rest of this podcast to you to talk about.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know.
Dangerous thing to do.
I know. It's a dangerous thing, but just stay on track,
just
dude.
start complaining and just start talking about nonsense. And who knows?
No, you won't do that. And then we can tell them about the conclusion about where we went a few years ago, and that is actually a discussion for what happened to us was a discussion for a different whole different podcast, as is the story of your father and how you wrote Where the Birds Never Sing. So, Jack Sacco, the presentation of the Shroud of Turin, please, off you go.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things, and please just jump in with questions, as we're going, because I might forget something. But I like I say, I started out with this thought that this is obviously fake, and it's not going to take that long for me to prove it, and then I won't really waste too much time with this because within a few weeks I'll be able to prove it's a painting, it's it's whatever it is, I'll be able to figure it out. And so as I started going through, I realized there were certain things about the Shroud that I'd never heard and never known, and a lot of the things that were trumpeted through the media as facts. I don't know if you know this, but the media sometimes is fake news. I don't know if you.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah,
it's all true.
Well, it's amazing. Sometimes it's actually fake news. So I started to realize that a lot of the things that they were saying, for example, about carbon dating, were just weren't factually accurate. They weren't even true. And so I started. I said, well, if those things are not true, and then some of the things that I was reading, even in books, I would realize, like people would say, well, it's paint and that's not really human blood and all these things, and the image I can recreate that image. Well, I started to study those things and thought, looked at the data. For example, I've seen the shroud in person, as have you, and one of the things you can tell when you approach it, when you walk in it, that it's not a painting.
It's clearly not a painting.
Clearly not a painting.
That is so absurd. Anyone that's seen it will be like, well, what are you even thinking?
Now, you might be able to convince somebody it's a painting if they just look at a photograph of it, because you can't tell. But if you see it in person, you could see it's not a painting. Even, just as much as if you saw you or me or, in person, you could tell, well, that's not a painting. That's an actual person there. So, when you see the shroud, you realize that's not a painting. There's no paint up there. And it has these incredible characteristics. Like if you go within 6 feet of the shroud, the image on the shroud disappears. And
you can't see it,
you don't see an image. You just see blood. And there's certain things that I was able to find out. Like, for example, the shroud, just for people to give you an idea, the shroud is 14 feet long. It's long and it's wide. It's like 4 feet wide, and the measurements actually come out to be 2 cubits by 8 cubits, and the weave, everything else, and are very, very ancient. People say it was made in the Middle Ages, but it clearly wasn't. And the data backs that up. There's pollen on the cloth that and we're not talking about on the cloth. There's pollen on the cloth from Europe, of course, but there's pollen in the weave of the cloth. Like it was attached to the threads before they were woven into a cloth. And that pollen that's in the weave of it is from the area of Jerusalem, and some of the pollen is from plants that have been extinct for almost 2,000 years. But it's from plants that are indigenous to Jerusalem, the area of Jerusalem, and some of which, like I say, have been extinct, and some of which only bloom in the springtime. And in addition to that, there's calcium on the cloth. And nobody ever talked about it, but there's calcium on the cloth from a rare form of limestone called aragonite. And this calcium, there's only like 8 or 9 or so aragonite limestone quarries in the world where this could possibly be. And so if you examine that calcium, that aragonite limestone on the shroud and compare it with an electron microscope to the other quarries, it only matches one place in the entire world. And that place is the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. So we know the shroud had to physically be there. And also we can trace it. We can trace it with writings. We can trace it with science, with evidence. For example, the pollen and the aragonite limestone. We can trace where it was in different places throughout history. And then there's an image on the cloth. There's blood on the cloth. There's an image on the cloth, and the image has been a mystery for as long as the cloth has existed. And people, didn't know how it got there. And so one of the theories that, came up was, well, it was painted in the Middle Ages. But the thing is that the image is not actually as you know, it's not a painting, but it's got a lot of interesting characteristics. For example, the image is a photographic negative. The image is a photographic negative. So people say, well, from the Middle Ages. Well, the thing is, photography hadn't even been invented then and would not be invented for another 500 years. So if
and
an
it wasn't
artist...
even, by the way, so it wasn't even discovered. That wasn't even discovered until Segundo Pia took the picture.
In 1898, right?
And he looked at the negative. He was like, hang on a second.
Yeah, people didn't know they just thought it was a ghostly image, but they couldn't tell what. And then when in 1898, the first photograph was taken of it, and this man named Segundo Pia, who was an amateur photographer, but he was a lawyer in Italy, and we're familiar with Segundo Pia, right? Because we
We are.
visited his friends, and
Yes, we did.
and he looked at the photographic negative when he pulled it out of the chemicals, and he realized that the photographic negative of the shroud was actually a photographic positive. It actually showed the face. And if anybody's ever seen a photographic negative, it looks very different than a photographic positive, of course. We used to, now you just take a picture on your phone and you see the picture, but we used to get negatives. And if you hold that negative up to the light, sometimes it's hard to figure out what it is,
Yeah.
or who it is. You have to look at the opposite image to sort of get a sense. And the photographic positive and the photographic negative and positive on the shroud has details that are not even visible to the naked eye. You have to have fluorescent photography. You have to have extreme magnification, etc. So some of them are microscopic. So the fact, the idea that an artist could have done this is impossible. It's just not.
Well,
Matter of fact,
it's
the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, said it's impossible. It couldn't have been done by a human.
so basically, what you'd have to do if you believe the narrative, and we can go into this a little bit further on. If you believe the narrative that it was painted in the Middle Ages, then what the person would have to do would have to figure out somehow. Not only they'd have to go forward in time and figure out photography, and
Yeah.
then go back and take a picture of the person, and then go forward again and
Yeah.
paint it.
Time
And we can
travel.
talk about what the elements of the painting, which again that is impossible. It's not painted. They have to time travel, but they'd also have to get a cloth that had pollen woven into it from the 1st century AD from Jerusalem, or they would get that pollen somehow would pick itself up, travel against the prevailing winds, right? And drop itself into
Prevailing
Europe
winds,
and somehow
right.
figure its way through to a piece of cloth that was exactly the size of a burial cloth of a Jewish man.
Right.
That was, and by the way, I'll let you carry on. Actually, let me let you carry on about
Yeah.
the characteristics of the image, and then because I want to talk a little bit about the actual properties of the cloth itself. But please carry on. I love this. As you know, I've seen you do this presentation 100 times, I think, and it's so exciting to me that there's something out there that people don't even know, that it's, even if you don't believe in a religion, and if you think that there was this guy that was killed, and we can go into that, the victim, as they said on the
Right.
the scientists called him the victim. It's still an incredible item. I mean, it just boggles the mind. So anyway, please carry on about the image on the shroud.
Well, the thing is that if the image has these incredible characteristics to it that can't be duplicated. We can't duplicate it with all our technology today. And by the way, the way I looked at it, I didn't look at it from I'm not a theologian, so I didn't look at it from a theological perspective, and I didn't look at it from trying to prove scripture or anything like that. I was just looking at it like, what is this and what is it not? What is it? What is it not? And what does the data say? What data is there? What data is not there? So, like for example, paint. They said, "Oh, there's paint." Well, there was no paint. There is no paint, and it's not just me saying it because I saw it. There's biochemists, etc., who have examined it, and they said there is no paint on it. There is no paint. And I know that people have contacted me saying there is paint, but these people don't. They've not seen the data. So and even my whole presentation on it that you've seen, I don't talk any scripture because that's not my wheelhouse. It's not what I do. And if somebody's affected by it, if somebody's not affected by what I say, fine. And if they are, that's fine too. But here's just a matter of facts that happen to be laid out. And so there's this image on this cloth, And the image has these incredible characteristics. For example, we talked about the possibility, they say, because of the carbon dating, which was, I can tell you about the carbon dating. I was a person, as a scientist engineer, I just assumed that carbon dating was factual, that it was like DNA testing. Like, when you had a carbon dating, then that was the final word. But what I started finding out when I delved into it was that even archaeologists say we don't go by carbon dating. I mean, if carbon dating supports what we already know, we can find out some things. But carbon dating, especially carbon dating done in the 1980s, was so rudimentary and so flawed. And it was especially interestingly, that method, there was a new method that they did on the shroud, and they hadn't really used it before. And I think it was called the AMS method. And even the guy who discovered that method or created that method said it won't work on the Shroud of Turin. You know why? Because the Shroud of Turin is not something found in nature, like a leaf in a volcanic ash or an organism in a glacier. Hasn't been sealed off. It's been, first of all, it's man-made, and then it was subject to fires. It was people have, for 1,000 years, it was just out in the open. People were lighting candles underneath it, touching their babies to it, and
It was over the
breathing on it.
balcony, wasn't it? And people
It was hanging on a balcony yeah.
And they would bring their kids up, and trust me, from someone with a bunch of kids, like they can be snotty and have all kinds of things, and they were touching
even when they did the Vatican. By the way, a lot of people might not know this. I didn't know this until I started all this. The Vatican has one of the most prestigious scientific institutes in the world. It's called the Pontifical Academy. The Pontifical Academy is funded by the Vatican. It's located on the Vatican grounds, but it operates independently from the Vatican in that there's no one telling them you have to come up with this conclusion or that conclusion, which, by the way, and this is my opinion, is that that's not even the way it works at universities.
No
because
kidding.
a lot of universities, their funding depends on what they find out, and so I've seen professors at different universities change their results in order to get more funding.
Right.
So I've witnessed this. So, but that's not the way it works at the Pontifical Academy. Whatever you find out, that's what you find out. And so it's one of the most prestigious. And so they had said, hey, this method of carbon dating it's this new method in 1983 or whatever it was, is not going to work on the shroud. It just won't function properly. And of course, the British Museum at that point, and I'm not saying anything bad about British people because you're one of them.
I used to be.
You used to be. That's right. You used to be one of them. And it's a nice place, but the British Academy, or the British, whatever it was, said, "Oh, see, the Vatican is anti-science. Catholic, the Church is anti-science. They're afraid." And so the Vatican said, "Okay, we'll just do it." And when they actually did, and I have photographs of when they cut the cloth, and instead of cutting they had a protocol. The protocol was to take 6 different pieces from different places on the shroud, send them to 6 different laboratories and kind of see what happens, carbon dating. And the people who did it completely ignored that protocol the day of the cutting. They, instead of cutting 6 pieces from 6 different pre-approved places, they cut 1 piece from down in the corner, a piece that had been burnt in the fire of 1532 and had been re-sewed together by the nuns in 1534. And so they cut that piece, and then they cut that 1 piece into 3 sections. And they sent it off.
And it's where everyone would pick it up, right? Because if anyone knows, if ever you make your bed, where'd you pick up the bed sheets? At the end. You don't pick the bed sheets up from the middle unless you're a moron.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and by the way, talking about the fire, Jack, the fire
A fire. Yeah.
That was it. The shroud was in a silver case, right? So can you talk about that a little bit, about the silver case and how it melted?
The silver case, it was in a fire in 1532, and the church burned down. It was and it was in a silver container, and the silver melted. And I think, and don't hold me to this exactly, but I think silver melts at around 800 degrees centigrade, somewhere in there. And anyway, the silver melted, and it burned the cloth, and so there's marks all over the cloth. Part of the cloth was burned completely away, and since it's a big cloth, like I say, 14 feet cloth. It's a big, heavy cloth. And 2 years later, the Poor Clare nuns there they sewed patches in the holes that had been burned into the cloth, and they also put a backing cloth on it. And so they were experts. These women were experts. In some places, it's hard to tell where they put the patch and where they sewed things together, because they were so good at what they did. And so it's believed now. Just I'll fast forward. In the 1980s, they trumpeted, well, this carbon dating, this one little spot that was cut into three pieces, all these results came back that it was from the Middle Ages. And interestingly enough, just as a side note, the three labs didn't even come back with a close. The results weren't even close enough to each other to validate them. They were too far apart, and they should have been much closer. Put it that way. The three labs should have been much closer in their estimations, but they were kind of far apart. In fact, there's one of the threads on the shroud. This is interesting. One of the threads. You never heard this on the news. One of the threads and this is a fact. One of the threads on the shroud, at one end of the thread, at one end of one of the threads, was carbon dated to be from the year 200. The other end of the thread was carbon dated to be from the year 1000. So unless it took that person 800 years
it's a very old sheep. I'm just saying, it's a very old sheep.
Very, matter of fact, just so people know, we were able to determine a lot of incredible details about this that I'm not even getting into. For example, just so you know the depth of details, the person who wove the shroud, the person who did the weaving, was left-handed. We can tell that from the twist of the way it was put together. So there's a massive amount of detail that can, and it all the details weave together and they fit each other. So one thing they didn't.
So the weaving, it was done on a linen loom, right? I believe
on a loom, if I
remember correctly.
That's right, on a loom that would only be allowed to weave linen and possibly cotton. You could also weave cotton. You couldn't weave wool on the same loom, but you could weave linen and cotton. And there are microscopic. There's no wool in the shroud, but there are some microscopic. It's pure linen, but there are some microscopic traces of cotton. And the cotton that's in there is a certain type of cotton called Gossypium herbaceum, and that type of cotton only grows in Egypt. So cotton doesn't grow anywhere in Europe. So the fact that the idea that this was manufactured in Europe, and and so the modern understanding of this, and once again in the 1980s, it was really broadcast like the shroud is a fake. It's proven now that it's a fake. Well, the guys who even did the carbon dating were saying that, hold on, we didn't prove that it was a fake, and my opinion is all they really proved was that method of carbon dating was very unreliable, and that, by the way, that method of carbon dating is no longer used.
Hmm.
They've moved on to thermoluminescence and other methods now, because that method was faulty from the get-go, from the beginning. And then to try to use it on a man-made product that had been in fires and been touched by people and been just sitting out in the open, that's the provenance of this cloth was very different than like I say, a leaf that's been in a glacier. So,
So
but
let's go
now,
back to let's go back to the image, Jack. Sorry, let's go back to the image because the image is
yeah,
just utterly fascinating. So let's talk
yeah,
about the claims that it was painted, which,
mhm.
like I said, not everyone has seen it like we have, and when you see it, you're like, that's just absurd. So if you can tell the viewers why it's so absurd, I mean, without seeing it, right? Because there's actual properties there that make it impossible to have been painted, including that distance. You'd have to go in. By the way, this is one of the things you have to do: is you'd have to kind of stand 6 feet away and paint an
Okay.
anatomically perfectly correct man
In a photographic negative.
in a
And
photographic negative.
here's another thing: the blood that was on the image. There's blood on the image, and by the way, people say, "Oh, it's animal blood." No, it's human blood, type AB, and it's got both X and Y chromosomes, so it's a male blood. Back then, they only had two genders. Yeah. So it's male blood, and so and the blood went on first. It's not, in order to paint something, you would think that you paint the image and then you put the blood where it should be on the image, but the blood was there first. So to think that some of the blood, some of the wounds, some of the scabs or halos um, are actually microscopic. You can't even see them with the naked eye. And so you can only see them under high magnification and these types of things. But they went on first. And so
How do you
that's a
know that?
clue. Because if you look up under a little bit of the blood, there's no image underneath it. So if the image had been put there first, and then the blood had been put on top of that, and if you lift up some of the blood and look underneath it, there will be an image underneath that. But in this case, the blood, if you lift it up, there's no image. That tells us that the blood was there first, and the image was formed afterwards. And the blood actually stopped, blocked the image from being formed underneath it. So you look at that's one of the clues. The other thing is the image has these incredible characteristics that we talked about. It's a photographic negative. It sort of acts as an X-ray, and you can see like bones, inside the hand. You can see the bones here, and without and you can and also you can see like where the wounds really are. For example, the wounds are not in the hand, they're in the wrist, which is where they would be. And all artists have always painted the wounds as being in the hands, but technically it wouldn't be in the hands. The Romans crucified people and they put the nails in the wrists, otherwise they would fall off. They would pull through. um, the What else? There's anatomically absolutely perfect. The human body and its relation to and its reaction to stresses and wounds, things that people didn't even understand medically until 100 or so years ago. So the idea that an artist could have done this is ridiculous. Also, the image is only, like I say, it's not only a photographic negative, but it's only on the top fibrils of the cloth. It's very faint. Again, invisible within 6 feet because of something called neural lateral inhibition. It's you can't see it if you get closer than 6. You can't see the image. You can still see the blood, but there's no image. And then you back up, and then you can see the image. So the supposed artist would have had to do this away from 6 feet. Also, there's no application of the cloth. There's no movement. There's no, some people say, well, it's dust, it's lightning, it's corona discharge. They come up with all these theories, but none of those theories, we tested those theories. None of those theories work. None of those theories would cause that.
And it's
Uh,
non-directional, right? Like, so if you were to paint something you'd see the brush strokes, you'd see the direction
Exactly.
of the brush, and
Exactly.
also that the paint would seep in deeper than the top fibrils.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
See,
Nothing was
I
added.
did pay attention in class. I'm just
You
telling
paid
you,
attention.
I did.
You got so, and it's been determined by biochemists that nothing was added to the cloth to bring about the image. Nothing was added to the cloth. Nothing organic, nothing inorganic. No paint, no substance, no dyes, nothing was added to the cloth. And I'll put it this way. This even sounds more dramatic, but it's true. Nothing found in the known universe was added to that cloth to produce that image. And there's a lot of reasons we know that to be the case. And one of those reasons is that there's the image is only on the top fibrils. It never seeps deeper. The blood that's on the cloth seeps down into the cloth. The burn marks that from that fire in 1532 seep, they go all the way through the cloth. They burned part of it off. So we can tell what a burn looks like. We can tell, but the image, there's nothing in by fibril. By the way, and you know this, but when I say fibril, I don't mean fiber. A fibril, if my arm was a fiber of the cloth, then the hairs on my arm would be the fibril. So with the fibril, it never goes deeper than a few microns, and it's on the top fibrils, and it's very, very faint, but it can't be washed off. Even hydrogen peroxide won't take that image off of the cloth because there's nothing added, organic or inorganic, to produce the image. So the idea that in every Easter you hear about these people talking about so-and-so at such and such junior college, the art department, he figured out a way to reproduce the image on the Shroud of Turin, and and they always do this at Easter time. And this art professor has figured out how to reproduce it, and he'll be outside, and he'll pour some stuff in there was nothing poured onto the cloth. There was nothing added to the cloth, and it never produces it. Sometimes they produce something that's similar, but it'll have one or two characteristics the same, but it doesn't have all.
I'll tell you what it isn't, and I want you to talk about this. It's not three-dimensional encoded.
It's not. It doesn't have all the other characteristics, including three-dimensionality. The shroud has that image is not only a photographic negative. It also has three-dimensional information encoded into it, and no other image that we can produce has that type of information encoded into it. The shroud has it encoded into it, and it's actually remarkable. I mean, it's like I say, we can't. It can't be created now. People act like, oh, well, we could do this. No, you can't do it. And we've tested every way. I say we, between me and I became sort of part of the group of researching all this. It can't be duplicated.
So Jack, tell me about what is that? What was that NASA scanner that they used on it? They used some kind of NASA scanner over the top of it, right? And it made it go.
Yeah, it was called the VP8 image analyzer, and this was technology from the 1970s, and that showed that, oh my God, there's three-dimensional information on here. And now what we could do is take that three-dimensional information and with today's technology and create an actual 360 degree, because we know things about the person. I always say, and the way these physicists and scientists and different researchers looked at this, they didn't say, we're going to prove that this is Jesus. In fact, their thought was, we're going to prove that it's not. But the more they researched it, the more they realized that it wasn't easy to disprove. And as a matter of fact, like I say, I've looked at it for years and with a lot of people, and I've never seen one shred. I've heard a lot of opinions, but I've never seen one shred of credible evidence to indicate that it's fake. So now what is capable is to create I was going to say these researchers, they never said Jesus. They always would say the victim, because one of the guys who was doing the research was the coroner, Los Angeles coroner, and he looked at it. He examined the whole image and everything from the point of view of here's a person who was dead. And by the way, some people say, well, I've heard this over and over. Well, Jesus wasn't actually dead. He was just in a coma. He was knocked out. He was unconscious. He was whatever, put in his tomb. No. This man, whoever this was dead. We know, we have facts, we have proof that he was dead. And because some of the wounds are post-mortem, we know this for a fact. We can tell. He was not living.
Can you go into that? Because firstly, tell everyone, like you said, he was called the victim, right? They never said that this was Jesus. It was the victim. There was a lot of atheists and agnostics, and there was a couple of Jews who studied it as well. As
right.
There was everybody studied it, all different walks of life, and they called him the victim. Tell me what the characteristics of the victim were. How tall was he? What you can see from the negative image, what he looked like. Can you just go into that, please?
Yeah, he was 5'9.25", about 175 pounds. He had the bone structure. Ethnologists have told me he had the bone structure, facial structure of a Sephardic Jew. The Sephardic Jews, and we can't tell this from the Shroud, but Sephardic Jews were known as people who, some of whom, they were distinguished in that some of them had blue eyes, believe it or not. So we can't tell the eye color from the Shroud, but it's just an interesting fact of history that some of those people had, some of those Jews had blue eyes. But like I say, we can't tell that from the Shroud. But 5'9.25", very healthy. We can tell it was muscular. This was a very, very strong person, very healthy and very active, robust. You have to realize that this man was not sickly. He went from being very healthy to being very dead within a few hours. So we can tell the torture that he went through, the wounds. For example, there are scourge marks on the back, and we can only see the ones that broke the skin. So there's about 120 that broke the skin. We can tell that there were two people with the scourges standing at about 2 feet away from him, 45 degrees. The man on the left was a little bit taller than the man on the right. And the victim's hands were tied above him. He was stripped naked. And the scourge was we can't see, a lot of them didn't penetrate the skin, but a lot of them did. And we can see the ones that did penetrate the skin and did cause bleeding. And then we can tell that happened first because of the blood clots. And then a tunic or so was placed, or something, a cloth was placed on him. And then a crown of what we would consider a crown of thorns. It was actually a cap. It was more like a helmet of thorns was placed on the head. Very, very sharp thorns that are consistent with a type of thorn bush in and around Jerusalem called Ziziphus spina. Very sharp, like 1 inch or so, razor sharp thorns that would go actually up under the scalp, cause a lot of bleeding. This is very consistent with this being sort of pounded onto the head. And then we can tell that there were several, that a cross beam was placed across his shoulders, because we can tell this because of the movements and the reopening of the wounds and extra contusions. And then we can tell that he fell multiple times onto his chest, causing blunt chest trauma. Sometimes he would stick out his right knee, both knees really, but mostly the right knee, and there's a lot of bruising and there's dirt there. At some point, the cross beam was taken off. My opinion, and we do, you can't really tell this, but my opinion is we know that the crossbeam was taken off at some point, and he carried it from that point on. My theory is that he probably couldn't get up because, there's a lot of traditions that say Jesus fell 3 times on the way to Calvary. Well, in reality, this man fell many more times than 3 because the scourging would have rendered him almost incapable of walking. It would have damaged his um, tendons in his legs, his back. It would have. A lot of people would. Most of the time, people would die from the scourging, but they would die a few hours later.
And you can see on the this is the amazing thing.
His hamstrings were really torn up, and so he was mostly staggering all the way and falling multiple times. I bet I would assume that there came a point where he couldn't get up, and they had to take the beam off. And when he could stand up again, they put it. This time they didn't attach it to his wrist. They with rope. They put it over his shoulder, and interestingly, they put it over his right shoulder, which to me tells me he was probably right-handed.
So originally, let me just clarify a couple of things.
There, and then he was carried the rest of the way. We can tell where he was stripped again from the garment. So we can tell the order, the timeline. The wounds on the back from the scourging were reopened, and then the nails were driven into the wrists, both wrists, causing incredible pain. In fact, it cut part of what's called the median nerve, which is one of the main sensory nerves, and it causes excruciating pain. If it had cut the nerve completely, it would have been easier. But the fact that it cut the nerve and then the nail was just grating on the nerve, what was left, we would call that excruciating pain. And interestingly, the word excruciating is from the Latin. It means from the cross. Excruciate, from the cross. And so that was the type of pain that we described there. And then that's when the most difficult and most painful part of the process started, which was the actual crucifixion itself. And so, we can tell a lot about the timeline of what happened there. So he went from being a very healthy person to, we also know that no bones were broken on this victim. He died within 2 or 3 hours of being on the cross. And like I said, we know he was dead. I took the actual scourging from the shroud, and recreated the scourge. This is what it would look like, the flagrum. And so it was a 3 strands here, and they were usually made of leather. And at the very end would be these little plumbate, and they look like little dumbbells. Like you were saying, they had little, and sometimes they'd be made of lead, sometimes they may be made of bone, or different things like that. And they would be coming at you in such force as you would be hit with this that they would actually they would penetrate the skin, and they sometimes had to be pulled back out of the body. And so it was tremendous force. And the Romans had a law at the time that you couldn't kill somebody doing this, for one reason or another. You couldn't kill them. But the point is that you would do so much damage, internal damage to them, in their kidneys and their liver and et cetera, and their internal organs, not to mention their muscles, that it would introduce toxins into the blood, potassium, et cetera, and they would die within a few hours anyway. But then, and in the case of the man in the shroud, they did this to him, and then they crucified him.
And we know about the trauma because of the elevated bilirubin count, right, in the blood that you were talking about.
Elevated bilirubin count, right? Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So he was scourged. He was forced to walk, like I say, and you said earlier on that he fell multiple times, so he had blunt chest trauma. And what's the other thing that's interesting about the shroud, about the image on the shroud, is you can, and I'd like you to discuss this about, so when you were talking before about it hitting that nerve, that's kind of like akin to like just hitting your your funny bone 1,000 times more painful, right? Like that.
Yeah,
That's the
that is.
kind of thing it was. But
Except in this case, I'm sorry. Go
sorry,
ahead.
Jack. Now talk about the angles of the blood and how we know that the person apart from the holes in the hands and in the feet, the angle of the blood dripping from the
Yeah.
wounds in the wrist.
Yeah, sometimes if you look at the shroud and you look at like enhanced photographs of it where you can see the blood very clearly, what you'll see, it looks like the blood is actually creeping up, going up the shoulders and going up the arms, and it's at all these funny angles, which it is going at strange angles when your arms are down in front of you, but when you lift the arms up and what would be considered an attitude of crucifixion up, like this, then you see that all the blood comes out and it goes directly down according to gravity. By the way, I got a nail. This is about the size of the nail that was used, and I got this at Home Depot, so it's just a regular nail. But the one that was actually used on this victim was square, and like I say, it was put here. There's a place there called the space of Destot, Destot. I may be pronouncing it incorrectly.
Can you move your hand over a little bit so it's in the middle? There you go. Thank you.
There you go. And so it goes through there, and like I had mentioned before, it only cut part of the median nerve. If it had cut it completely, it would have been better. But since it was just part of it, then any movement, and there was nothing holding him there except for that nail, one in each side, then that was excruciating pain. And with any slight movement, and he had to move in order to breathe.
And so the other aspect of that about I want to talk a little bit about the appearance in a minute, but first I want to tackle the fact that they called him the victim, and yet he had all these things that were firstly, they're all consistent with a Roman crucifixion, right? And they would have had that down.
Exactly.
Like they would have had that down. All these things are completely consistent with a Roman crucifixion.
Yeah, and in fact, they're consistent with the archaeological and historical Roman crucifixion, but not consistent with artistic depictions of crucifixions. So the artistic depictions came years later.
I want to ask you about the artistic depiction in a minute of the person, the victim, or the person that they call Christ.
Right.
But as far as the image on the shroud is concerned, let's talk about that for a second. So he was physically strong, and the gentleman who was, like I said, the victim was in the shroud. He was physically strong because people think, a carpenter, right? I was making tables, but they were more like stonemasons back then. They were lifting heavy weights, right? Very strong.
Yeah,
individual.
I guess the word was tecton. He was he could build things with wood, and but he was a stonemason. That's how. If you go to Israel, and I've been there, you've been there, everything's built out of stone. That's why those buildings are still there thousands of years later. Everything's so. In order to be a carpenter, a builder, you had to know how to build with stone. So he was a very strong guy.
He was very strong. That's one of the things that you see when you properly look at that image and you see it there, because like Jack said, it's kind of like the shroud goes along and then it's wrapped over the body, right? So it goes like that with a body going inside it like that, right? So that's the way it is. So you see it's kind of odd the way it is, right?
Let me show you. Let me show you if I can get something out of my out of my case here.
It's a rabbit. No, it's not.
How about this? So I have a little guy here, and let's say it's a miniature shroud. But the way he would have been placed, the way he was placed, the way people were placed in shrouds, a lot of people think they were wrapped like mummies or something, but they weren't. They were placed this way. Like on a slab like this, and then the shroud would be draped over.
Right.
Could you see that where I was holding it? Like the body would be here, and then the shroud would be draped over. So that's why a shroud 14 feet long would cover the body. So it wasn't wrapped around, like I say, like a mummy. It was wrapped over the top and then down. And so that's the way all people were wrapped back then in burial shrouds, and that's the way this person was.
And when you start looking at whether or not it is the historical person that they say is Jesus Christ, right?
Right.
The crucifixions were very personal back then, right? Especially for high-profile people, right? Like people that were causing a bit of a ruckus. They really made an effort to stick it to them.
Right. Right. The crucifixions were a form of terrorism, and the Romans knew how to keep people under control. So, for example, if you stole, I don't know what capital offenses were back then, but let's say you stole the goats of somebody else, or the horse, or you killed somebody, or I know one of the offenses here was you said you were the emperor, you said you were God, or you said you were in charge, or you were the king. They didn't care for that. So what they would do is they would have a personalized, every crucifixion was sort of personalized. And we can see this because archaeologists have uncovered many, many burial cloths and and by the way, there are thousands of burial cloths that have been found. None of them have an image on it, except for this one. Okay. Also, the crucifixions themselves, we can tell, were all personalized. For example, if somebody had killed somebody or stolen something or whatever, they would. One of the things they would do was carry what's called a titulus out in front of them. They would have somebody walk in front of them with a sign that said what they did. So it's like, if don't do this. See, this guy did this. He claimed himself to be the king, or he beat another guy's, he stole another guy's wife, or stole his, or killed his other guy. If you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. So they did it as a way of making an example of people. And so in this particular case, there's only one crucifixion that is known of where they actually put a crown on somebody. And it's unheard of in any other crucifixion except for this one. And then you factor in the other things, like there's scourging and a crown of thorns and a wound in the side, and none of the bones were broken. And you start going through it, and this man was 33, about in his mid-30s. And you start going through these things, and then the probability of it not being Jesus starts to become astronomical. And did I say that correctly? The probability of it being Jesus, it becomes astronomical. Of it not being becomes minimal. And then, of course, then you have the image of what happened, what had to have happened to this man after the burial. Because I'll show you this. If I can show you this again with the burial and the placing of the man in the cloth. So now I have my slab here, and we put the victim there. He's dead. And they put him in a certain pose. They put his hands over his midsection like that, and then they put the cloth over like this. We know that once the cloth was laid down, we can tell this from the blood clots. Once the cloth was laid down on the man, the cloth was never lifted again, the cloth was never moved, and the body was never moved. But we also know, as a fact, that the body only stayed in the cloth for 36 hours. Now think about that for a second. What I said was, you heard correctly, the body nor the cloth was moved. But the body only stayed there for 36 hours, and then it was no longer there. So how can both of those things be true?
So how do you know that? How do you know that it wasn't moved, and how do you know that it was there for 36 hours?
Well, we know it wasn't moved because the blood clots would be different. They'd be broken. They'd be smeared. We can tell. And we also know it was only there for 36 hours because after 36 hours, the blood clots themselves would look different. You can tell, for example, even those of us who are not people who are not forensic experts, we can tell if we look at a wound or a cut on somebody or even on ourselves how long ago it was. We can tell, oh, you must have just cut yourself. It's a fresh wound. We have no expertise. Most people have no expertise in this, but you can see like, oh, it looks like you must have cut yourself a couple of days ago or whatever, just because of the blood clots and how they look. So people with expertise, forensic scientists, coroners, etc., they can tell, the approximate time of death. And they can tell, based on blood clots, etc., because there's the fibrinogen system, and blood clots form over time. And so you can tell it wasn't less than 36 hours. If it had been less than 36 hours, the blood clots would look differently. If it had been more than 36 hours, the clots would look different. And also, if it had been more than 36 hours, there would have been decomposition. And there's no decomposition anywhere on the cloth. No decomposition on the cloth. So we know that the body was only there, and then the body was not there. I mean, there's no body there. But like I say, the big mystery comes from the body wasn't moved, the cloth wasn't moved. Nobody took the body out. Nobody lifted the cloth up. Where'd the body go? If neither the body nor the cloth was moved, how did it not be there? Because it's not there. It wasn't. It's not there.
So we're going to get into this in a minute because you had a theory. Or you have a theory. You had a theory. And I want to talk about that in a minute. But I do want to. By the way, I have to do this because I'm getting into the YouTube thing. Please like and subscribe if you like and want to subscribe to this kind of content. I have to say that, Jack. I'm learning. I'm on the job. I'm learning.
Like it, subscribe, give it a thumbs up.
Yeah, all that. Thank you. I know if I do that now, that's going to come up on the. It's kind of weird. Why does the Sistine Chapel show Jesus as this fresh-faced, very kind of almost effeminate man? And then all these other pictures that we know these days have this guy with long hair and a beard.
Right. Yeah. In early depictions of Christ, up until about the year 525, all the depictions of Christ pictured him as a young Greek-looking boy with fair hair and no facial hair, just almost a young kid. And then this is the depiction of Christ at the time. That's what everybody saw. And then in the year 525, there was a major flood in a place called Edessa, which is modern-day Şanlıurfa in Turkey. And the major flood destroyed half of the city, killed about a third of the population. And so they were rebuilding after this flood, and they found up in the wall, up in above the gates of the city and the walls around it, they found a niche, and inside there they found a cloth. It was the shroud. It had been hermetically sealed. They found a lamp. They found a plaque, and they realized that this was the true image, the image of Edessa. They had called it before, this miraculous image, and there's a whole story behind that of how it got there and all the miracles that happened there. But it had been hidden away for several hundred years because of the persecution of the Christians and the persecution of whoever. They were trying to destroy this cloth and whoever had it. And the people hid it away, and it was rediscovered in the year 525. And on the cloth, there's the image of the man with the long hair, the sort of tortured face, the beard, and at that point, all images conform to that shroud, to the image on the shroud. Which is, if you look at the old icons that depict Jesus, it was in the year 525 that they all started to conform to that image, not a young boy, not a young Greek blonde-haired boy. It was that image. So now today, if you just drew a very, rudimentary, childlike sketch of Jesus and showed it to anybody, say, "Who is this?" They'll say Jesus.
They know who it
But
is immediately, right?
there's no description of Jesus in the scriptures. There's no description of him anywhere other than on that cloth. And so, but everybody knows it because it changed. It changed art history at that point. In the year 525, art history was changed, and all depictions of Jesus conform to that image that's on the shroud.
It's amazing. Now, I'm not saying that this is probably my favorite part of your talk, because I think that when I very first heard the talk, it was so impactful because I felt, again, like I've been lied to for a long time about something, and something had been dismissed, right? Like something had been just dismissed as like something weird and wacky, like the Loch Ness Monster, when really it really deserves more scrutiny, and more people need to know about it, because in effect, Jesus left the world a picture of himself.
Well, in fact, the history is so fascinating. It could be its own, talk about movie or miniseries. It could be its own series of just the shroud. What happened to the shroud and how it changed history, and the people involved, and the armies. There were armies, Matthew, that marched in order to capture the shroud, surrounded cities, and kings were healed, and they defended, and they were converted. I mean, there were things that happened with this shroud and the personalities involved, that were absolutely amazing. And it's like, people, I think people would find it incredibly fascinating to know. We looked at different clues as far as the image formation. We know, for example, like I said before, the blood was on there first. We know that the image is only on the top fibrils. We know that the image is a photographic negative. We know that it has three-dimensional information encoded onto it. We also know a lot of other things about the image. So we had to look at every, we didn't want to match one or two of the characteristics like the little art professors do, because, this, you can have a light bulb that has two characteristics, just like the sun gives off light and gives off heat, but it is not the sun. It's not a star, but it has two characteristics similar. So we need all those characteristics to match. Otherwise, that's not the method of image formation. And that's how we were able to rule out what it wasn't. Very easy to rule out what it wasn't, but what was it? And there's also no decomposition of the cloth. We know that the body was only inside the cloth for about 36 hours, not a lot, not shorter than that, not longer than that. We know that the body was placed in the shroud within 2 hours of the death, and we do know that the man was dead. But where did the body go, and how did it leave such an extraordinary image on the cloth? We know, for example, it was not oils emanating from the body that would produce a very different image. We know that it wasn't, often people say it was lightning or an earthquake or all these other things. We know it was none of those things. None of those things would produce any image. And like I said before, there are thousands of burial cloths that have been discovered. None of them, not one of them, have an image on it at all, let alone an image like this. So what is this one? Where did it come from? How did they get on there? So what I started doing is working backwards from the image. Like, what are the characteristics? And what could cause something like that? And I kept going backwards and backwards and backwards and deeper and deeper and deeper until I reached the quantum particles. Now, you and I have had long discussions about the quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and what that is. And, it's a very, it can be a very complex subject, but I like to make things sound as simple as possible. I oversimplify things, especially when I'm talking to an audience. Yeah. And, quantum particles, quantum theory is just a matter of, everything exists, and it exists down on the smallest level. And that smallest level, I call them quantum particles, just to be simple, because everything, as we know, everything is made up of molecules. The molecules are made up of atoms. And we know that the atoms are made up of smaller particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, and things like that. But those electrons, protons, and neutrons are also made up of even tinier particles. And when you get down, what are the tiniest particles? Well, I refer to those as quantum particles. And they're not, and technically, they're not necessarily particles. They could be particles. Sometimes they act like particles. Sometimes they act like waves. So, but let's just call them particles. Let's just simplify. And so, um, when I went down and started exploring the quantum particles and the quantum mechanics is basically a study of how these particles or whatever behave, how they behave over a period of time and how they, the probability of them being in separate places and getting from point A to point B, etc. But the simplification is we're trying to figure out how these things behave. And it turns out that although we're made of these particles, we are made of these particles, our bodies are made of these particles, everything that you see is made of these the same particles, then uh, instead of how they behave, what I discovered and what scientists have discovered is how they misbehave. They they don't really behave the way we think they should behave, and the way that it looks like they behave. And when you put a bunch of them together and create a chair or something, or another person, or anything, it's going to physically behave in a certain way. And the things that it's made of, interestingly enough, don't behave that way. For example, a quantum particle, and once again, I'm saying particle, could be a wave, but let's just simplify. A quantum particle of which you are made up of these things, this particle can be in two places at once. Now, I don't mean that they can travel back and forth between these two places very quickly, or it almost seems like it can actually exist in two places at once. Okay? So there's no space as we understand space, and as far as these quantum particles are concerned. And once again, these quantum particles are not existing in some magic vacuum somewhere. They exist in you. It's what you're made of. We are made of these particles. And just by the way, just to make it even more interesting, these particles that we're made of, humans are made of, came from exploding stars. So we're actually star
So the
material.
Coldplay song is real. We're all made of stars.
We're made of stardust. Exactly right. That we are actually. You look up into the sky, you see a star.
Jack, I knew it.
You're a star. You've always been a star. But now the rest of us turns out the rest of us are stars too.
Oh, dang it. So, and I thought I was special.
So, but that's beside the point. The point is that we're all made up of these particles. So these particles, they can do things that we can't even imagine doing, but yet we're made of these things. They can exist in two places at once. So that means if it can be in two places at once, then it's not in a place, it's not in space as we understand space, because we can only understand, our finite brains can only understand one place at a time. And if there's no space as we understand space, in order to get from point A to point B takes time, right? So if there's no space as we understand space, there's no time as we understand time, as we understand it. Now, our understanding is very limited. For example, if you went to a monkey, I guess. What a monkey? You tell me. I don't even know. Monkey has like 1%.
Well, one of my kids. I don't know.
So
one of my kids.
So a monkey has like 1% difference in DNA, like 1% or something like that, or a couple of percentage points difference in our DNA to a monkey. And monkeys are highly intelligent, right? But if you explain to the monkey, I'm gonna leave today, but I'm gonna come back Tuesday and bring you a banana. The monkey has no idea what you're talking about. All the monkey knows is when you show up with the banana, he's going to eat the banana. But he's not going to understand I'll bring you back with the banana on Tuesday, but I got to go get the banana. He doesn't understand that. So this monkey that is very intelligent, it has no idea what we're talking about. We could talk about philosophy. We could talk about all these things to a monkey. It doesn't know. And that's only just a percentage point or two different in DNA from us. So imagine if something is a percentage point or two higher than us. Okay, so any type of intelligence higher than us, we're not going to have any clue what they're talking about. We don't have a frame of reference. We can't think. So think in terms of the quantum particles. They're operating on a plane that we can't really understand any more than the monkey can understand you when you're talking to him about Socrates or a banana. So think about the fact that we think that we know everything and we're capable of knowing everything. We're not. So what I mean by that is that, just understand that we are capable of understanding that there are things that we can't understand. There are things that we don't
Yeah.
know. We don't know. We have limited ability to comprehend them. So the body, then, what I figured out is that the body, without going into massive, complex detail, this body that was wrapped in this cloth for 36 hours started to reorder on a quantum level. On a quantum level. In other words, energy didn't cause this resurrection. We were able to trace it. And once this reordering began, and why did it begin? I don't know. I'm not a theologian. Okay, I don't know why it began. There was no stimulus. There's no catalyst. There's no jumper cables. There's no lightning. There was nothing that could have caused this that I can think of. And there's no evidence that anything did cause it to start. But we know that it did start. And why? That's up to the theologians or somebody else to figure out. But once it did start, we're able to trace it. What happened? What happened next? What happened after that? What's the consequences of this process beginning? And the reordering on the quantum level of this particular body, and not all the other ones that were wrapped in shrouds, but this one, the one that also had the crown of thorns, the one that also went through this crucifixion 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. We know it was in Jerusalem, as I said. So this particular body, once it starts to reorder, it would not stop until it reached what I call, and I coined this term, super order. Once it went to the point where it could reorder no more. The disorder would be death. The disorder after that would be decomposition. But it started going in the other direction.
It didn't follow the second law of thermodynamics. It went the other way, right? It didn't go towards entropy. It went the other way.
The other way, right?
Which we know these quantum particles do, right? We know that these quantum particles can go towards a higher state of order.
Direction. They can go the other direction without the addition of energy. And in fact, we know that they can actually give off energy instead of requiring energy to go the other direction. They can actually give off energy. So in this particular case, energy was given off, and so energy didn't cause this resurrection. The resurrection caused the energy. And if you want to know how far is that super order, can things reorder? The laws of entropy, as you know, the second law of thermodynamics has been happening since the universe. And if you want to say Big Bang or whatever, they've traced the universe to be 13.5 billion years old or something like that. Is that right? Does that sound right? So
I don't know. I'm an actor. I don't know. I just think that the amount of people that were looking when you said on here, me and Matt talk about quantum mechanics all the time. I bet they were like,
you do? Yeah. But you're a star, so you're part of the star system, you're part of the quantum particles of stars. So if you think about the fact that the second law of thermodynamics has been in process since the beginning, which means in the second law of thermodynamics, for people who don't know, it says that things are always tending toward disorder. That's what entropy is. The increase of entropy means the increase of disorder, basically, simplified terms. So things are always increasing in the matter toward disorder. Things are always tending toward disorder, and if left to themselves. And so if you think about the fact that this order has been going on for 13.5 billion years, okay, then backtrack a little bit and think about how ordered things must have been at the very beginning. If they've been disordering for 13 billion years, how ordered would they have been at the beginning? Okay, so this super order is way over there, where it's at the beginning of the quote Big Bang. It's at the beginning of the before things started to go disordered, before the second law of dynamics kicked in. So this and as these quantum particles in this body are reordering back to that, and why wouldn't they? But once it begins, then energy is released. And this is also, in fact, two gentlemen in 1980 won a Nobel Prize in physics for discovering that some quantum particles tend toward order and not disorder. And So in this particular case, if the body went through this process for whatever reason, then once it started, it would not stop until the body was super ordered. The release of energy that would be resultant from that would cause the image to be literally scorched onto the cloth. The resulting image would have every one of the characteristics that we see on the shroud. It would be a photographic negative. It would only be on the top fibrils of the cloth. It would never penetrate more deeper than a few microns. It would be impossible to remove. Nothing would have been added to the cloth. There would be no side images. It would be invisible within 6 feet. It would have three-dimensional characteristics, and on and on and on.
So there you have it. I mean,
so
that is it is unbelievable. I remember when we came back, because as Jack alluded to before, and we had something happen to us that was just unbelievable. We went to see the Shroud of Turin, and it was incredible. And all the things that happened around that are undeniable. And maybe if people really enjoy this podcast, that we can talk about. I mean, we could do a whole podcast on what happened to us on our trip to Turin and leading up to it. And
some of the most remarkable things didn't even happen to us. They happened to people around us.
To other people. And they were like, I don't understand this, right? Like, I don't understand what is going on. I remember having that conversation with a couple of people, and they were like, I need to take some time now to understand what this means and how this is. I mean, it really is. It's the only time. I tell people this. I haven't really disclosed this in public before, but it's the only time that I've experienced something that is supernatural, that I can say that other people saw, that we were involved in.
It wasn't just a feeling.
It wasn't a feeling. It was quantifiable. I mean, it really was quantifiable. Yeah. So that's how, and your theories, that's how the image got on to the Shroud of Turin. Absent of any other reasonable one.
Right. And people may say, well, that can't be true. It couldn't have happened that way. I thought the same thing until I just verified it over and over and over. And, if somebody says that didn't happen that way and they don't want to believe that happened for whatever reason, I don't know why you wouldn't want to believe that was what happened, or would have objections to that. But if for some reason somebody doesn't want to believe it, don't believe it. It's not going to change. Go on about your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is about this is that there are these amazing things that are in nature, in the world, and we should be curious. We should be curious about them. And I think that events that have happened certainly over the past few years have made a lot of people say, hang on a second, I'm questioning that. And not in a kind of crazy, kooky way, but just like, I don't know if what I've been told is entirely true. And scientists should, and you are a scientist, should question all the time. I mean, we should anyway, right?
Science is about questioning. That's what it's about. It's not about accepting a dogma, whether it's anything, but especially a scientific dogma. I mean, we've gone through that over the years, and to accept a scientific dogma, if you will, is always going to get you in trouble, because somebody's going to present you with some evidence that might contradict that dogma. So it's about a matter of always questioning and always looking at what the evidence is and going wherever the evidence leads.
And you alluded to something earlier on about these big universities and the reason why they do certain things and the reason why they say certain things. Unfortunately, and I said this over and over and over and over the past 4 years, is don't make people infallible gods that are completely benevolent all the time. There are some people out there that are completely benevolent and they become saints, and that's great. But a lot of people have agendas. And that can be money, that can be whatever. But with something like this in particular, when I saw your first presentation, you laid this all out. And again, for anyone that's watching, we had some technical difficulties, so I apologize. I hope it didn't ruin your viewing experience or listening experience. But when I first heard Jack give this presentation, it blew my mind, because, I mean, he's clearly a credible human being, right? I mean, you are, and I've known you now for a long time, and we discuss everything, right? I mean, we've been here, there, and everywhere,
right?
But one of the things I've always maintained is that the real truth about the shroud should get out there. So people then can make up their minds. They can either go, "Huh, that's nice, carry on." But at least they know the other side. At least they're not saying, "Oh, well, that's just a fake and it's this." At least they can point to it and say, "Well, hang on a second. There's something really interesting here." Aside from the religious aspect, as you and I know, we never talk about that side of things. We're not interested in that. When I did Finding Noah and I went and looked for Noah's Ark, it was always about the scientific approach. And in addition, with the people that were going on it, we made the documentary about them as well and their search and why they did it. And we incorporated a biblical and Quranic elements to that, but that was to support the historical claim that there was an ark or there was a flood, right? And that's all we're talking about here. Just look at it. There's one other thing I want to say. I will kind of like let people into, like, just peek underneath the curtain on this. Jack and I ended up going over to Turin, and the most amazing things happened to us when we were over there. Just unexplainable, a lot of it. Yeah. But we did get to see the shroud, and we got to speak to the guy that runs the Shroud Museum, and he said to us that there are microscopic bacteria that live on the surface of the shroud, because the shroud is in this giant case, which is bulletproof, and it's got is it argon in it, Jack?
Yeah, something
argon,
like that.
Right?
Yeah, that's
it's got like argon in it, but a little bit of oxygen. And he said the reason why there's oxygen in there is because there are these like microscopic bacteria that are protecting the surface of the shroud. And I was like, what?
Yeah, you think about a piece of cloth, which is a piece of cloth that's organic because it's made of linen, flax. That it very well could have disintegrated over the course of 2,000 years, but it didn't. It's there, and the image, everything is there, and the blood is still there.
And when you see it's just a no-brainer, right? You walk in there, and there's absolutely no way that it's a painting. I mean,
and there's also no paint on it either. But,
that's kind of a thing, right? Yeah, there's no paint on it.
There's no paint. I mean, I've had people call me and claim that there was paint on it. And one man said that he had done research. And so I checked out his claims and talked to the people who actually did the research, and they said, no, he was not there. He didn't do any research on it. He's just the guy talking. So there's a lot of that. And I always wonder, Matthew, like, why, as far as Jesus of Nazareth, I mean, if this had been if this were the image of a pharaoh or an ancient king or a Viking warrior, I don't think people would get upset. They would be like, wow, this is really interesting. But the fact that you say this is, people say, well, this is Jesus of Nazareth, and agnostics, atheists, even people, there was a man in the French Academy named Yves Delage in the early 1900s, who decided after he was an agnostic, he came to the conclusion, this is the historical Jesus of Nazareth. They expelled him from the French Academy at that point for saying that. And he said, I don't have a dog in this fight. He said, I don't know why. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a religious person. I don't care. He said, but the fact that if it were a pharaoh or a king or a warrior or something, I don't think people would get upset. So why would you possibly get upset about proof that the historical Jesus of Nazareth lived? When Jesus of Nazareth, theology aside, and I'm not saying anything theological, but just historically, the indication that we have is that he's probably the nicest person who ever lived. Yeah. There's no record of him doing anything bad except flipping a few tables over, which, we all have the urge to do. But he didn't harm anybody. In fact, the record is that he did the opposite. He healed people. He helped them. He comforted them. So why would people get upset about him?
Yeah, well,
I don't get it.
Again, I think that there's this, again, and we're straying into another topic now, but there's this kind of like aversion to anything that might be linked to a religion. And I think that's folly. I think it's folly. I think that we need to examine these things. Like I said, I mean, when I went up Mount Ararat, did I think the Ark was there? No, I didn't. Is it there? No, it's not. in my opinion, it's not there. Was there a flood? I'm pretty sure there was a flood. I mean, the evidence is all there. So if evidence is evidence, it's evidence. It doesn't matter. And that shouldn't shake your faith in anything, in science, in this and that. I mean, science is constantly revealing more. Right? The natural world and our advancement into sciences are revealing more and more and more about the natural world, right? It doesn't mean we're changing our opinion on things all the time. And like you said, that is what science is. So I don't understand why there's such a visceral reaction. I also don't understand why people aren't paying as much attention to it as they should. I mean, I love the fact, like I said, I've watched Joe Rogan's stuff on Atlantis. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think, you know, that place in Africa really does sound like it was Atlantis. And, you know, when you look at that with what Plato said, it makes sense. So let's look at it. Why we kind of go lose our minds, or people lose their minds when it's about Jesus or, you know, any other kind of major, let's say, historical figure, or why they just make up stuff when these people are meant to be all about the science and we're giving evidence for science. But I think it goes to a deeper issue, which is the slavish devotion to authority, because everyone just looked at what happened on that on the report, or what the press reported was the report, and went, "Oh, that's it." And nobody asked another question. And that's what whenever I tell people the story, they're like, "This is unbelievable. Why don't more people know it? Like, why aren't you on every single show? Because this is a massive discovery." I don't know. I'm personally curious. And listen, Jack, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank you so much for being such a great friend. And
thank you.
And
goes both
coming
ways.
on here and spending the time to explain your theory, and also talk about your experiences over all these years researching the Shroud of Turin. And if you guys out there like what you've seen, like and subscribe. What is it, Jack? Give it a thumbs up. Is that right? Give it a thumbs up.
That's right. Like and subscribe.
And put your questions down below. I'm going to have Jack back on if he's gracious enough to to tolerate me. He's going to come back and we're going to talk about his dad. His dad, I always say to people, Jack's dad was the real life Forrest Gump, right? He was in all these amazing like if you were to write a movie, which Jack has, he's written a book and he's got a movie. If you were to watch this movie, you go, that's just not humanly possible that man was in all these really important events in history. That's crazy.
Every one of them. He was right in the middle of every one of them.
He was right there. He was right there. And it's an amazing story and of a great American, and he has a great American son. So, Jack, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been fun. We'll have to do it again soon.